All right, now let's talk about the collapse of peace, which is, by the way, your next heading in your notes. The collapse of peace that happened between Russia and the United States. So, April 12th, 1945. April 12th, 1945, FDR dies. So he suffers a major stroke and he dies. And so his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. So Harry Truman is thrown into the presidency, and he's not a very good foreign policy guru. Let's just say that. He knows next to nothing about foreign policy. And this is a major problem because the dealings of his administration are going to be largely foreign policy related. So Truman goes into the situation with Russia, and basically his idea is to have a get tough policy. So he's going to get tough with Russia and show them who's boss. So he calls for a meeting with Russian officials very shortly after he's president. So just a few days after his presidency, April 23rd. So it's less than 2 weeks after he's president. He tries to strong-arm Russia into abiding by the agreements that they had made. And his idea is that he's going to get 85% of what he wants for the United States. So he's going to strong-arm Russia into making agreements in which the United States, if you have 50-50 or 100-0, the United States is going to get 85% of what they want to 15% of what Russia wants. What actually ends up happening is pretty much the reverse. So Truman goes in talking tough, and he basically says, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going to get this, 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 and this. And so they end up meeting in Russian-controlled territory in Potsdam, which is in Germany, but it's in Russian-controlled Germany. And Truman says, okay, this is what we want, but, okay, I guess we'll concede the issue of Poland to you. Sure, you can have your government in Poland. Well, there we just lost something we wanted. And then he says, we're going to recognize the government you have set up in Warsaw. So we're officially recognizing, as the United States, we're officially recognizing the Warsaw government in Poland, your communist government you have set up. Two things that Truman conceded on. And then, this is at Potsdam in July. So in April he gets tough. They have the meeting in July in Potsdam in Germany, Russian-controlled Germany. And Truman is going to accept some more compromise, like he's going to compromise and give the Russians more, by stating and agreeing to the fact that there's going to be an adjustment of the border, the Polish-German border, to give Russia more territory. The next thing we're going to look at is the problem of China. So America believed that for a peaceful world that has open trade, open communication, without spheres of influence, they believe that China, a free China, is key to this. However, we have the issue, as we have had since 1927, the issue of the communist movement in China versus the nationalist party. So we have the communists that want to take control, nationalize everything, redistribute wealth, and we have the nationalists that want democracy. The nationalists are headed by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists by Mao Zedong. And you see that from 1927 onward, there's a big rift going on in China. There's competition between the communists and the nationalists, and it eventually blows up into a full-scale civil war. By 1945, by the end of the Civil War, at least 1/4 of the Chinese population completely supported the communists. And then we have an all-out civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and their forces. And the United States tries to support them, the nationalists that is, not the communists. We want to support the nationalists because we have enough problems with the communists in Russia. So we give them money, we give them weapons. However, we have figured out at this point in time that the only way to allow China to remain a free country is an all-out war in which we participate. So we can't just let the nationalists take care of it because they don't have enough training, they don't have enough men, and they're just not able to handle the communists as well. So if we go in and intervene, it's going to be a very costly war for us. So we basically decide to abandon China. And we put our hope in a very unlikely place. Once we cut ties, we still support China, but we realize it's a lost cause. And we change directions, and we try to, instead of going with some other country that hasn't been belligerent with us in the past, we try to restore Japan. So Japan, the country that a few years ago had attacked Pearl Harbor, that we'd fought in a bitter struggle with, we try to revitalize Japan and make our relations with Japan more positive so that we have some kind of source for democracy and some kind of major power in Asia that supports democracy. Okay, let's talk about containment now. This is a major theory involving how we deal with communism that's spreading in the world. So we've realized that Russia's going to stay communist, and they're going to try to spread. We've realized that China is going to become communist, and they're going to try to spread that as well. So what we come to embrace as a doctrine, a foreign policy doctrine, is the idea of containment. So we're going to try to contain communism wherever we can. Truman adopts this, and he actually tacks something onto this called the Truman Doctrine. But the Truman Doctrine goes beyond just trying to contain it to actually supporting the people that are fighting against it. So this is a quote by Truman explaining his foreign policy. And he says, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures." So Truman Doctrine is, we will support nationalists. That's basically what he's saying without saying it. We're going to support nationalists, read into that democracy. We're going to support nationalists against communist attacks. So if the communists try to, by force or by economic means, whatever they try, we are going to support the nationalists against them. A key to containment was the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan was an economic plan to rebuild Europe, and the idea was this. The communists, particularly Russia, is promising European nations prosperity. Russia is saying, join with us and we will help you rebuild, and you will have more prosperity under Russia, under us, the Soviet Union. You'll have more prosperity under us than you had before when you were a free country. Now, a lot of the countries in Europe aren't really sure what to do, but they do know one thing. They are hurting economically. So the Marshall Plan, there were many motives. I mean, there's obviously the humanitarian. You don't want to see people suffering. There's the profit motive of if Europe is completely in shambles, guess who's probably going to have to support them? The United States. They're going to ask the U.S. for loans, and then we're going to pay out more loans that are never going to be repaid. So the Marshall Plan, it wasn't simply to practice containment, but that was a large part of it. But anyway, the idea was that if we can support these countries economically by helping them rebuild their infrastructure, we're not going to loan them money continually. What we're going to do is we're going to support industry, help them rebuild, so that they can eventually help themselves. And if they're prospering economically as an industrial nation, they won't be tempted by the offer that the Russians give them. Or even if it's not a Russian offer, they won't be tempted by the propaganda of the communists within their country. So anyway, Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who was a major military figure in World War II, by the way, he now became Secretary of State. He wants to provide economic assistance for short term to European nations so that in the long term we won't have to support them. But anyway, you're going to see, if you have your book open, page 762, and I just want to cover this in case it's on one of the DBQs or FRQs. This picture here that says saluting the Marshall Plan on page 762, that's a positive thing. It's showing that Marshall is helping Europe help themselves by investing in industry. So over a 3-year period of time, the Marshall Plan takes $12 billion and invests it into industry in Europe, rebuilding factories or building new factories in Europe, in infrastructure. And by the end of 1950, European production, industrial production, had risen almost 70%. It had risen 64%. So that's a very sizable increase in production, which meant that a lot of the countries we were helping were no longer being intrigued by offers of prosperity by the communists. Now let's look at what we're doing back home in America, non-foreign policy related as far as no diplomats involved, but what we're doing at home to try to secure our position and stop the spread of communism. First thing you need to know is that Truman revises the Selective Service Act so that there are some changes made to it, but he basically he wants the draft to be revamped in case there is a war. Secondly, the Atomic Energy Commission, 1946, it's tasked with developing new nuclear technologies, particularly weapons, so that by 1950 we have the hydrogen bomb, which is much, much more powerful than the atomic bomb. The National Security Act of 1947, which creates a new Department of Defense. It creates the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. So the National Security Act basically creates new branches of government that are tasked with investigating, gathering intelligence. All these things are targeted at communism and how we can stop its spread. So this is all part of the policy of containment. All right, now let's talk about how NATO was formed. Your heading in your book is The Road to NATO. That's NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So here's what happens. The three Allied zones of Germany are merged into one Allied zone. So now we have the Allied zone of Germany and the Communist zone of Germany. And Stalin does not like this at all. So June 24th, 1948, Stalin decides that he's going to blockade the Allied portions of Berlin. So he's going to say, Americans, you cannot get in by road to bring supplies to these people in Berlin, in the Allied zones. And his plan was that he would break the will of the Allies by, basically he'd say the Allies are causing these people to starve. Well, we didn't want to risk all-out war, but what we did do as Allies is we airlifted, we just flew over Russian space in Germany, and we airdropped supplies to the people in Allied Berlin. And Stalin, in the spring of '49, lifts the blockade because he realizes it's ineffective, it's not doing any good. And in April 1949, we established NATO. There are 12 nations, France, Britain, United States, and a few other European nations that sign on to this agreement. And it was an agreement that said, if Russia attacks one of us, we all fight in defense of that nation. Russia responds in kind by, later, but in 1955, they're going to establish the Warsaw Pact, which is their own version of NATO, the communist version. So you're going to see as the Cold War heats up, no pun intended, that the Warsaw Pact and NATO, they're going to grow exponentially. Okay, the last thing we're going to cover in this chapter is reevaluating the Cold War policy. So a couple things happened that affected how we handled the Cold War. First, in 1949, September, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. So now the major advantage we had at forestalling war was that we had a weapon that was matchless. No one else had the atomic bomb. Well, now Russia has it. So there goes that advantage. Also, China completely falls in 1949 to the communist forces there. So we step up our form of containment to basically say that, and this is National Security Council -68, so it's NSC 68 is what this is known as. And it basically says that previously we had only intervened in areas of strategic importance. Now we're going to intervene anywhere, anytime, for any reason to stop communism, basically, is the change to containment. If there is a country, no matter how small, how obscure, if it is being invaded by communists or there's a communist group trying to take it over, we're going to intervene.